Hello everyone, my name is Trisha Gupta. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford studying sharks and rays. And I wanted to thank Elasmo Week for inviting me to participate in this event this year and giving me a chance to present my research. So today I'm going to be talking about Elasmobranch conservation in the context of a tropical developing nation with case studies and insights from some of my work in India. So just to start off with, what are elasmobranchs? So as I'm sure most of you know, elasmobranchs are a group of cartilaginous fish, which means that their internal skeleton is made up of cartilage rather than bone. And they are made up of species of sharks and rays. They're also a highly diverse species group with over 1,000 species that are found all across the world. So elasmobranch species have been recorded in all oceans and seas and are also found in many freshwater bodies. Elasmobranchs are also some of the most threatened species groups in the world today. So recent assessments have found that about 36%, which is more than 1/3 of all known species of elasmobranchs, are currently threatened with extinction according to the IUCN Red List. And one of the main threats to these species is from overfishing and fishing pressure, because in the end of the day, they are fish and they do have a commercial and economic value. So they're caught in fishing vessels and fishing gear all across the world and are sold and traded. And because of their life history characteristics, which include having a slow growth and low reproductive output, they are especially threatened and vulnerable to all of this pressure. Coming to the context of India, India is actually amongst the top 3 shark and ray fishing nations in the world. And what this means is that the amount of sharks and rays captured by fisheries in India is amongst the highest in the world. So we generally move between second and third position after Indonesia and Spain. And elasmobranchs are captured in the multi-species, multi-gear fisheries that currently operate in Indian waters. So just to explain this a bit further, Indian fisheries is highly diverse and it ranges from large-scale fisheries like the trawl vessels that you see on your left in this picture over here, to small-scale fisheries that can be as simple as a fisherman with a cast net in the water that you see on the right side over here. And in between these two extremes, you have a whole range of all kinds of fishing vessels and gear that operate in our waters that all have their own ways of fishing, their own species that they target, and different practices. And we have over 150 elasmobranch species that are found in Indian waters. And many of these species are regularly caught by all of these different forms of fisheries. So in some cases, elasmobranchs are targeted by fishers, which means that they go out fishing with the intention of catching and selling these species. But in many other cases, elasmobranchs are bycatch, which means that they're not necessarily targeted, but are incidentally caught or opportunistically captured. But even in these cases, these elasmobranchs are brought back to shore and they are sold. So they do contribute to some extent or the other to the income and livelihood of these fishers. And it's not just fishers that benefit from these elasmobranchs. A lot of small size coastal species of sharks and rays that are commonly captured in the country are often traded and sold locally by small scale traders. Many of these small scale traders are actually women. So these women also depend on sharks and rays for at least a part of their livelihoods. Sharks and rays also form important food sources in the country. So they tend to be a cheap and easily available source of protein. They're cheaper than most other fish species, which is why they're commonly consumed in many parts of the country, especially by lower income communities. So just to sum it up, what makes things very challenging and complex for elasmobranch conservation in India is that, for one, catches of elasmobranchs have been declining in the country, even though fishing effort on the whole is increasing, which really indicates that their populations are in trouble at the moment. But we have very few laws in place for the conservation of these species and management of their fisheries. So there are 10 species of elasmobranchs that are protected under the Indian Wildlife Protection Act, and these species can't be fished. but all others, it's perfectly legal to catch them and sell them within the country. There is also a ban on the trade and export of shark fins from outside the country, which has to an extent helped curb some of the targeted fishing for sharks for the sake of their fins. But as I said, a lot of the fishing is often opportunistic or as bycatch. So in that case, these laws that protect specific species aren't very useful. There's also the livelihood and subsistence aspects. So as I mentioned, these species do contribute to livelihoods, they form important food sources, and that's something that needs to be considered when we think about their conservation. And finally, there are nearly 4 million active fishers in India today, with millions more people that are engaged across the entire fisheries supply chain. So any kind of conservation measure or management measure for elasmobranchs will directly or indirectly impact all of these different fishers. And that's definitely something to be considered when we think about their conservation. So all of these points highlight the need for interdisciplinary approaches for elasmobranch conservation. And this means that we not only need to look at the ecology or biology of these species, but we really have to consider the human dimensions as well and understand the kind of economic role that elasmobranchs play, the kind of social values that they have, and the socio-economic impacts of any kind of conservation measure. So now I'm going to go over some examples and case studies of some of the work that I've done in India using interdisciplinary approaches for elasmobranchs. So we'll start with the case study of the fisheries and bycatch of sharks and rays in Malvan. So Malvan is a fishing town on the west coast of India. Not only is it a major fishing center, but it's also a major tourist center. It, like many other parts of India, it also hosts a very complex, multi-species, multi-gear fisheries. As I mentioned earlier, that ranges from large trawlers to very small scale fishers that go out on a small non-motorized boat for a few hours of fishing. And previous studies have found that there is a substantial catch of sharks and rays in this region. So as a project of Dakshin Foundation, which is a research and conservation NGO based in India, we conducted landing surveys for elasmobranchs for over 2 years in and around Malvan. What landing surveys do is that we monitor and record the elasmobranch species that are captured by fisheries in this region, make note of their biological characteristics such as size, sex, and other important factors. And we also record fisheries information such as what kind of gear these species are captured by, where they're caught from, how much are they sold for, and so on. And from these landing surveys, we learned that catch in this region, elasmobranch catch, seems to be dominated by small-sized coastal species such as spade-nose sharks, milk sharks, scaly whiprays, and other very small coastal species that don't really form the typical image of a large shark. And we also found that about 43% of species that we recorded from this region are actually threatened with extinction, meaning that they fall under the categories of vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered as per the IUCN Red List. A bulk of the catch is also composed of juveniles as well as gravid females. For example, the picture that you see here are juvenile blacktip sharks that were caught by a gillnet boat. So this does indicate that fishing grounds in this region may also be used as breeding grounds or nursery grounds by a lot of these shark and ray species, which is something that is important to study further. And finally, our data showed that bulk of the elasmobranch catch in this region actually comes from trawl fisheries. And in this case, they're not really targeted, but they are more bycatch or opportunistic catch that these species are just caught in trawlers but are brought back and sold anyway. So now that we had this baseline information, the next step of our project was to look at how we can reduce some of the bycatch of elasmobranchs, particularly in trawl fisheries, where our research found that there is indeed a high bycatch rate. So in collaboration with researchers from the University of Oxford, we use the mitigation hierarchy framework in order to assess bycatch mitigation measures. So what the mitigation hierarchy framework is that it was originally developed for the terrestrial context, where it was used to mitigate and reduce impacts of development projects on biodiversity. And this was then adapted for the marine context in order to be used to understand how to reduce bycatch of threatened species in marine fisheries. So how the framework works is that you set a bycatch reduction goal and target for your fisheries. For example, you can say that you want no net loss of your bycatch species. There should be no net loss of their populations. And then there are 4 sequential steps of the mitigation hierarchy framework that together help you meet your bycatch reduction goal and target. So you have avoidance, which includes bycatch measures that help you avoid bycatch of that species entirely. Minimization, which include measures that help you reduce bycatch of the species to as much as you can. Remediation, these measures help you reduce the impact of bycatch on your species, given that if they are caught, how can you reduce their mortality? And finally, you have offset measures that then works to offset the impacts of bycatch on your threatened species at another site. So we adapted this framework for our study site in Malvern, and we set our target as a minimization of bycatch of Elasmobranchs in trawl fisheries as compared to their current levels. And under the 4 sequential steps, we developed certain hypothetical bycatch reduction measures that we wanted to assess for this context. So under avoidance, we proposed the use of spatiotemporal closures. So through our landing surveys, we identified certain fishing grounds that appeared to have higher bycatch rates of Elasmobranchs than others. So we proposed the closure of these grounds for the few months where there was the highest bycatch rate. Under minimization, we proposed a restriction of the benthic net, the benthic trawler net, because again, our landing surveys found that the benthic net had higher catch rates of juvenile Elasmobranchs as compared to the pelagic net. So under this measure, we proposed a restriction of this net for a few months during the potential pupping season. Under remediation, we looked at 2 potential measures. One is the use of bycatch reduction devices, which are these special types of nets that allow the escape of a shark or a ray once it's been captured in the trawler. And finally, the last measure we looked at was onboard live release. This involves fishermen releasing a shark or a ray back into the water from their boats, if they were alive, of course. So we did not consider any offset measures for the study because we realized that they would not be feasible for our context. So now that we had these 4 hypothetical measures, the next step was to assess how effective these measures would actually be. So there were 2 forms of assessment that we looked at. The first was the technical assessment, which looked at how effective each of these measures would be in actually reducing bycatch or mortality of Elasmobranchs. And the second assessment was a feasibility assessment, which looked at how effectively each of these measures could be implemented in the socio-economic context of Malvern. So we used data from our landing surveys. We also conducted semi-structured interviews with a number of trawl fishermen and boat owners. And finally, we looked at secondary data from literature. And we used a combination of all of these data sources in order to inform our assessments. So coming to the technical assessment, we found that the avoidance measure, which is the spatiotemporal closures of certain fishing grounds, is probably going to be most effective when it comes to actually reducing the capture and mortality of most Elasmobranch species. And on the other hand, measures such as the onboard live release had quite a mixed level of effectiveness because it was very species dependent. So you have certain species like guitar fish, for example, that are known to have a fairly high survival rate even after they're caught and released from a fishing boat. So in that case, this measure would be effective. But for other species such as the scalloped hammerhead shark, they're known to have very high mortality rates upon being captured in a fishing net and would not survive. So this measure would not work for them. Coming to the feasibility assessment, we actually saw a very different story. So the avoidance and minimization measures that had a high technical effectiveness were actually found to have the lowest effectiveness when it comes to their feasibility. What fishermen told us is that these measures would have a high impact on their overall fish catch and hence on their incomes. And if such a measure was to be implemented, they would generally not comply with it, and enforcement would be a high challenge. What one fisherman told us is that if any fishing grounds are closed, we'll have to shut down our boats and go hungry, which summarizes the overall perception towards these measures. And on the other hand, the onboard live release measure, although it had quite a mixed effectiveness, technically speaking, was found to be the most effective in terms of feasibility. This is because Elasmobranch generally contributed very little to the overall income and earnings to fishers. Our interviews found that they generally contributed less than 5% towards a trawler boat's income. And while this 5% is still, it's not a very small amount, it's still something that fishers were willing to try out because it was overall a low economic impact. And it was an easy measure to do because they just had to release sharks and rays from their boat and it would not impact the rest of their catch on the whole. So it was the most preferred option by most of our respondents. So this just showed that measures that were technically more effective, like avoidance measures like the spatio-temporal closures, would not be we would not be able to implement them in the context of Malvan or most likely in any other part of India just because of their lack of feasibility. So unfortunately, a lot of classic conservation or fisheries management measures that are used in many parts of the world, such as closures of fishing grounds or marine protected areas, do not have the best history of success in India because they tend to be not very inclusive of the fishing community and generally don't include or involve the fishing community in any of the decision making process and have led to a lot of conflict in the past. So instead, when it comes to any kind of bycatch reduction or fisheries management, as our study showed, it's important to instead work alongside fishing communities and develop measures that would be more acceptable to them, even though they aren't as technically effective. So we did find that onboard live release would work for certain species, like species of guitar fish, and it can be implemented as a short-term measure to also start engagement with the fishing community. And then over the long term, more technically effective measures could be developed with participation of the community. So with these results, we then developed an outreach book in the local language of Marathi, which was distributed among the local community. This was done to share the overall findings of our research and give something back to the community, and to also raise a bit more awareness on the threatened status of sharks and rays, and ask community members and fishermen specifically to try and release juvenile sharks and rays that were caught in their nets. So this is one way that we hope that we can continue to engage with the community and hopefully develop or implement some of these conservation measures in the future. So the next case study that I'm going to talk about is a research project related to guitarfish. So giant guitarfish and wedgefish are collectively known as rhino rays, and they have been recently assessed to be the most threatened marine fish species group in the world today, with almost all guitarfish and wedgefish species being assessed as critically endangered. So guitarfish and wedgefish have a lot of life history characteristics similar to many other Elasmobranch species, where they have slow growth rates, low fecundity and reproductive outputs, late maturity, and so on. But another factor that puts them especially at risk is that their fins are considered to be of very high value. So in many parts of the world, guitarfish and wedgefish are specifically targeted and caught for their fins, which are then exported to East Asia, where they're used as a delicacy, similar to shark fins. And it's because of this that a lot of these species have been particularly under threat and have had their populations on the decline. Guitarfish and wedgefish are also often found in very nearshore coastal habitats, which makes them especially vulnerable to a whole range of different kinds of human activities that occur in these regions. So, interestingly enough, in many parts of the world, guitarfish have been observed to occupy and inhabit very, very shallow waters right by the coast. And this is something that we've seen in one of our study sites in Goa as well. This is also on the west coast of India. And we've observed the species of guitarfish, the wide-nosed guitarfish, inhabiting very, very shallow waters right by the beach. As you can see in this video over here. So we suspect that they may be using these habitats as potential nursery grounds, because we do see a lot of juveniles found in these regions, but this is something that we still need to look into and confirm. But one thing that is a high possibility is that their presence in these very shallow coastal regions means that they are highly threatened, not just by the fishing activities that occur in these regions, but also the tourism that occurs along the coastline of Goa, as well as other development activities that generally occur in these regions. So for my PhD, I'm going to be conducting some research on guitarfish in Goa, specifically looking at understanding their habitat use and habitat characteristics, and seasonality using local ecological knowledge, specifically fisher knowledge. I'm also looking to understand their interactions with fisheries to see if they are being captured in the local small-scale fisheries that operate in these regions, and if yes, what kind of gear and vessels are they captured in. And finally, I'm interested in understanding their social and economic values. So basically, once they're captured, what happens to them? What are they used for? How are they traded? And apart from the economic value, what kind of local social values and cultural values that these guitarfish may hold. So I keep collectively saying guitarfish, but we do know that there are at least 2 species that are found in these regions: the wide-nosed guitarfish, which I showed you the video of, also the sharp-nosed guitarfish, and potentially other species. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to collectively just refer to them as guitarfish. So for this study, we're conducting interviews with small-scale fishers in this region in Goa, and this includes gillnet fishers as well as the artisanal fishers that operate the short seine fisheries that you see in this picture, and also a few fishermen who work on trawler and purse seine boats. So some of our initial findings so far, because the study is not yet complete, is that we're able to map out, based on local ecological knowledge, where these guitarfish are found along the coastline of Goa, and potentially identify some critical or important habitats where they seem to be occurring at a high abundance. We're also be able to understand the characteristics and features of the habitats that they tend to be found in. We have some information on their seasonality. Fishermen are telling us that they generally see a high abundance and occurrence of guitarfish right after the raining season. So that's around August and September every year. And they also note a higher abundance of juveniles during this time, which may indicate that these months may be the pupping season for these guitarfish species. So interestingly enough, we found that fishermen over here don't really target guitarfish, but instead they're generally opportunistic catch or bycatch, and they hold quite a low value. And this was surprising because, as I mentioned earlier, in many parts of the world and even in other parts of India, guitarfish are targeted for their fins, which are a highly valued commodity. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. The fins don't seem to have any particular value or use, and instead they're generally sold and used for their meat. So if guitarfish are caught by the fisheries in this region, they are either taken home by the fishers as take-home consumption for their families, or they're sold in the markets and then again generally purchased by locals and used for local consumption. We're also finding a lot of mixed perceptions of the fishing community when it comes to the population status of these guitarfish, because about half of the fishers that we've interviewed have told us that they perceive or believe guitarfish populations to be declining, which is what we expected. But the other half have told us that they perceive an increase in guitarfish populations in this region over the last decade, which is interesting, and it's something that we're going to investigate further. So using all of this baseline information and data on guitarfish, I hope to be able to design conservation interventions that are locally appropriate and feasible for these species, such as things like payments for ecosystem services. And hopefully over the last few years of my PhD, I would like to assess and trial out some of these interventions. Okay, so the last case study that I'm going to quickly go over is that of seafood consumption. So when it comes to conservation of Elasmobranchs or other threatened marine species, we often have a tendency to focus on the fisheries end of the problem, looking at the kind of regulations and interventions that can be implemented on the fisheries end. But it's also equally important to look at the other end of the supply chain, to the consumers, because, for example, we are witnessing an increasing demand and consumption of seafood in India over the past few decades. And increasing demand for seafood only means increasing pressure on our marine ecosystems and marine species to meet this demand. So there is a need for more sustainable consumption of seafood in the country, because sustainable consumption can help drive and incentivize the development of more sustainable fisheries, which will then have positive impacts for a range of different marine species, including threatened species like Elasmobranchs. So, for example, there are initiatives like in-season fish that are found in the country. These initiatives produce seafood guides and calendars that raise awareness among seafood consumers and help them make more sustainable choices. So these calendars use data and information on the biology of different fish species, their breeding cycles, and also the kind of fishing methods that are used to capture them, and then provide recommendations every month as to what kind of species are relatively safer to consume and what kind of species, what species should be avoided based on this information. So specifically for Elasmobranchs, we are now conducting some research to understand the characteristics and drivers of shark meat consumption in certain parts of India. Because while we know that Elasmobranchs are consumed by different communities across the country in different forms, there's very little information about who these consumers are, why they're consuming it, and what's the prevalence of shark meat consumption. So by understanding some of these factors that are driving consumption of these species, we hope to use this information to develop better outreach and behavior change interventions in order to increase the sustainability of shark and seafood consumption, and to work towards better conservation of these species. So some of the key take-home messages that I've learned through all of these different research projects is that first, it's really important to use interdisciplinary approaches, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, especially in the context of a developing country like India when it comes to conservation of any threatened species. Understanding the human dimensions of the issue and including that in terms when you're developing any kind of conservation measure is very important. We also need to move beyond approaches and measures such as blanket bans in protected areas. Now, while these approaches have worked in many parts of the world very successfully, they're not always appropriate for the context of India, where there's so many more complexities and a lot more livelihoods that are involved when it comes to Elasmobranch fisheries and conservation. So we need to work towards more inclusive, developing more inclusive and locally appropriate solutions for Elasmobranch conservation. And finally, it's important that we consider the system as a whole. So not just the fisheries, but also the trade and consumption aspects of Elasmobranchs and their fisheries, so that we can design appropriate interventions at each of these different levels to have greater conservation outcomes. That's it for me. I want to quickly thank Elasmo Week again for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm really excited to be a part of this event. Also, quick thank you to the organizations and funding agencies that are supporting my PhD, as well as the other research projects that I've done over the past few years. My supervisors, E.J. Milner-Gulland and Divya Karnad. And also a quick shout out to the different co-authors and collaborators that have worked with me on the case studies and research projects that I've mentioned. So I've provided my email address here as well as my social media handles. So if anybody has any questions or want to discuss any aspects of this work further, I'm happy to be contacted and yeah, discuss it with you. Thank you.